I still remember that afternoon like it happened yesterday, the way a single sentence can split your life in two. Stop whining, it's already sold. Those were Eric's words, spoken so casually in my own kitchen, as if he were commenting on the weather. He stood there with his arms crossed, staking out space like he owned the house, while I clutched Samuel's old coffee mug, water dripping down my wrists from the dishes I'd been washing. My heart stuttered when I realized what he meant, and in that moment I felt the floor shift beneath me. That watch, Samuel's Rolex, wasn't just a thing. It was the weight of 43 years on my wrist, the quiet tick that still made me feel his presence each morning when I wound it the way he taught me. And now Eric, my only son, had stripped that from me with the indifference of someone pawning off junk. I asked him, my voice thinner than I wanted, if he'd truly sold his father's watch without a word to me. He rolled his eyes the way he used to when he was a teenager, dismissing me with a laugh that cut deeper than any argument. "Mom, it's just a watch, just a watch." I could feel my throat close with the kind of disbelief that tastes metallic, like a penny pressed too hard against your tongue. 6 months after I buried my husband, I was standing there realizing that grief for my own child apparently came with an expiration date. And when I pressed again, demanding to know which pawn shop, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. He only checked the sleek smartwatch on his wrist, probably worth more than what he'd gotten for the Rolex. That's when Lori finally lifted her gaze from her phone, sliding her sunglasses down like she was in some glossy magazine spread, rather than my cramped Boston kitchen. Her tone was dipped in sugar but sharp enough to cut. "Oh, good. She's finally being reasonable. Honestly, Francis, clinging to material possessions isn't healthy." The way she said my name, with that patronizing little curl of her lip, made my skin prickle. I could almost hear the whispers she'd been spreading at church coffee hours, or to neighbors like Mrs. Grant down the block, planting the idea that I was slipping, that I couldn't let go. Lori always had a way of sounding like she knew better than everyone else, even Samuel, and now she was using that same voice to tell me how my husband would have wanted me to grieve. I bit back the words I wanted to spit at her, the truth that Samuel would never have wanted his memory cheapened to $800 and a vacation fund. Instead, I held on to silence, but inside me something had started to shift. I'd spent decades managing other people's accounts at the bank, balancing numbers down to the penny, smoothing over clients' mistakes with patience, but standing there, with Eric's smug indifference and Lori's condescension suffocating me in my own kitchen, I knew this wasn't about a watch, or even about grief anymore. It was about respect, about the line they had just crossed, and about how I was done letting anyone tell me how to mourn the man who loved me more than anyone ever could. Lori leaned back in her chair and, with that tone she used when she wanted to sound wiser than me, said, "Samuel wouldn't want you living in the past." The words burned, but I swallowed them, biting my tongue so hard it almost hurt, because what I wanted to shout was that she had no right to speak for him. Ever since the funeral, she had been telling me what Samuel supposedly would have wanted, and it always seemed to line up with me handing over something of his to them. Eric finally looked up from his gleaming smartwatch and mentioned Harborview Pawn down by the harbor, saying it like he was doing me a favor. That thing on his wrist probably cost more than whatever he got for Samuel's Rolex. "They gave me $800, he added with a shrug, as if that settled the matter. $800 for a 1978 Submariner, the watch Samuel worked 3 months of overtime to afford when Eric was just a baby. The watch that never left his wrist, except for the day he died, when the hospital nurse pressed it into my hand in a plastic bag, nestled next to his wedding ring. I couldn't stop myself from whispering that it had been worth at least $3,000, and Lori laughed under her breath like I had just made a joke she didn't find funny. "In what universe?" she said. Her words clipped and sharp. To her, it wasn't running properly, so it was worthless. To them, everything was measured in what it could be sold for, never in what it had meant. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that the only reason it had still been ticking was because of me. Every morning, I wound it with careful fingers, listening to that faint click as the gears came alive, a sound that reminded me Samuel was still with me in some small way. For them it was just an old watch, but for me it was the heartbeat of our marriage, the thread that tied 43 years of mornings, evenings, and all the life in between. And standing in that kitchen with their dismissive laughter echoing off the walls, I realized they would never understand the difference between a price tag and a memory. I remember blurting out that I was going to get Samuel's watch back, my voice steadier than I felt, and Eric just smirked on his way out the door. "Good luck with that, Mom. We're flying out tomorrow morning," Lori trailed behind him, pausing long enough to tilt her head and put on that counterfeit sympathy she wore like perfume. "Francis, you really should think about therapy. This obsession with Samuel's things isn't healthy." Then the door closed with a crack that seemed to echo through the empty rooms, leaving me with the sour taste of betrayal thick in my mouth, and the same silence that had become my unwelcome companion since Samuel's funeral. But here's what they didn't understand. 40 years of managing accounts at the bank had taught me the difference between desperation and strategy, and I was finished playing the helpless widow they thought I was. Harborview Pawn was exactly the kind of place I pictured in my mind when Eric tossed the name at me, as if he were talking about a sandwich shop. The air inside smelled of stale cigarettes and metal, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale green tint that made everything look like it had been sick for years. Shelves sagged with cheap guitars, outdated electronics, and jewelry that seemed to have been stripped of meaning the second it crossed the counter. Behind the glass case, a man leaned forward, his arms covered in faded tattoos, his face worn down like a man who had carried 1,000 strangers' grief and traded it for crumpled bills. Before I even opened my mouth, he looked me up and down and said, "You hear about the Rolex?" My breath caught. I asked him how he knew, and he shrugged, almost kindly. "Your son said you might come by. Said you were having a hard time letting go." It felt like someone had pressed their hand against my chest, hard. Eric hadn't just stolen the watch. He'd anticipated my grief, prepared the world to dismiss me as an old woman who couldn't move on. The man introduced himself as Leo Turner, and though his voice carried a kind of weary compassion, his words cut anyway. "Look, ma'am, I feel for you, but business is business. I paid fair market value, fair market value." The phrase rattled in my skull like loose change, as if you could put a price tag on the sound of Samuel winding that watch at dawn, while the coffee pot hissed in the background, as if you could measure the weight of it in my palm that awful day in the hospital, when the nurse pressed it into my hand with his wedding ring. 43 years, reduced to $800. I steadied myself against the glass counter and told him plainly, "I'll buy it back, whatever it takes." Leo shifted on his feet, his hand brushing the edge of the counter, and for a moment he almost looked embarrassed to be the one telling me. "Whatever you're willing to pay, ma'am, it won't matter," he said quietly, his eyes darting away. "It's already gone. A guy came in this morning. Cash on the table, no paperwork, no returns in this business." The words landed in my stomach like stones, each one heavier than the last. My chest tightened as I pictured some stranger walking the streets of Boston with Samuel's watch strapped to his wrist, carrying around the one piece of him I could still touch, while I stood there empty-handed because my son wanted spending money for an Italian vacation. I must have looked pale because Leo's voice softened, and he leaned closer as though confiding something risky. But here's the thing, his tone dropped, almost conspiratorial. "We found something odd when we cleaned it up before putting it out." He disappeared into the back, leaving me clutching the edge of the glass case as if it might anchor me. When he returned, he was holding a small manila envelope that looked completely out of place among the pawn slips and jewelry tags. He set it down gently, sliding it toward me like it was fragile. There was a hidden compartment in the back of the watch. Real clean work. Had to have been a jeweler. This was inside. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, the paper whispering against my skin. Inside was a folded sheet, the edges yellowed with time. I unfolded it and froze. I knew that handwriting as surely as I knew the lines of my own palm. Samuel's careful, deliberate script. My name stared up at me. Francis's birthday, July 15th, 1955. The day I knew I'd marry her. My breath caught in my throat, tears pricking hot against my eyes. Below the words was a string of numbers and letters, written in the same neat hand, something that looked less like a love note and more like a code. My pulse thudded in my ears as I traced the characters, realizing that after 43 years of marriage, Samuel had been carrying a secret on his wrist every single day, hidden in plain sight. I held that slip of paper in my trembling hands, staring at the neat black ink as if it might rearrange itself into something familiar. SS 4457C 0815DS. My throat tightened. In 43 years of marriage, Samuel had never once mentioned anything about a hidden compartment, never hinted that the watch he wound every morning before coffee carried more than just time. To realize he had kept something like this right under my nose all those years, it made the floor sway beneath me, as though I didn't quite know the man I had loved since I was a girl. Leo watched me closely, his tattooed arms folded, the red name tag on his chest catching the flicker of the buzzing light. "You recognize it?" he asked, careful, like he was treading on something private. I shook my head, but inside something stirred. Those letters and numbers tugged at me, too deliberate to be random, too personal to be meaningless. Samuel had always been methodical, meticulous with records, always writing things down in that same exacting hand. Bank account numbers, tax files, lockbox codes. I had watched him do it for decades. This had to mean something. My voice broke a little as I asked, almost too quickly, "The man who bought it, what did he look like?" I saw Leo's expression shift, the easy weariness replaced by something more guarded, his jaw tightening. "Why?" he asked. I swallowed hard, forcing down the ache in my chest. "Because Samuel hid this for a reason, and I have a feeling whoever walked out of here with that watch may not have bought it for the timepiece. He may know something I don't." For a long moment, Leo just studied me, as if weighing whether I was a grieving widow or someone about to drag him into trouble. I leaned in closer, letting him see the grief that still clung to me like a second skin even after 6 months. My voice dropped to a whisper. That watch was all I had left of him. "I'm not asking you to break the law. I just need to know. Did the man who bought it seem like he knew about the compartment?" Silence stretched until finally Leo exhaled, his shoulders loosening. "He didn't say much," he admitted, "but when I mentioned we'd found something inside, his whole face changed, got real interested. First thing he asked was whether we'd opened it." His words chilled me, because in that instant I understood. I wasn't the only one searching for Samuel's secrets. A shiver crept up my spine, raising the hairs on my neck. I asked Leo if the man had given a name, but he shook his head. "Paid cash. No paperwork required. That was the rule of the pawn world." And suddenly, I hated it. Leo hesitated before adding almost reluctantly, "But he did ask right away if we'd had any Rolexes come in recently. Said he collected vintage pieces." My heart sank. Whoever that man was, he hadn't stumbled on Samuel's watch by accident. He had been looking for it, specifically for it. And worse, he might have known about the hidden compartment all along. By the time I walked back to my car, my purse felt heavier than it ever had, the small folded paper inside burning against the fabric like it carried a live current. I sat behind the wheel with my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dash and trying to steady my breath. Samuel had hidden this for nearly half a century, hidden it from me, the woman who thought she knew every corner of his soul. The question looped in my mind. If he kept this secret, what else had he been hiding all these years? That night I found myself in my bedroom, sitting at Samuel's old desk. The lamp cast a yellow pool of light across stacks of manila folders and binders, the smell of old paper and ink filling the air. Samuel had kept everything, bank statements from the 80s, tax returns filed with meticulous notes, ledgers of investments that looked so ordinary I had never given them a second thought. I traced my fingers over the edges of the papers, the way you might touch relics in a museum, wondering if the answers were tucked between pages I'd walked past 1,000 times. The slip of paper lay in front of me, the code staring back. SS 4457C H0815DS. I whispered it under my breath like a prayer, hoping the sound might unlock its meaning. I combed through every account we owned, flipping through folders with shaking hands, checking accounts, savings, the one safety deposit box at the downtown branch, Samuel's modest retirement fund. Nothing matched. Nothing even came close. For all his conservatism with money, for all the years he told me we had to clip coupons and stretch paychecks, he had been keeping something apart, something he hadn't trusted me, or maybe hadn't dared to see. Samuel's records had always been plain and predictable. Savings, checking, a modest retirement fund, nothing flashy, nothing hidden. Or at least that's what I had believed. I was still surrounded by piles of folders when my phone buzzed across the desk, the screen lighting up with Eric's name. For a second, I considered letting it ring out, but old habits die hard, and I answered. His voice was sharp, annoyed. "Mom, Lori's upset. She says you caused a scene at Harborview Pawn." A bitter laugh slipped from my throat before I could stop it. In what twisted world was trying to recover my husband's stolen watch considered causing a scene? I told him plainly that I had gone to buy Samuel's watch back, but someone else had beaten me to it. "See? Problem solved. Time to move on," he said, his tone so casual it pressed against my chest like a weight. For a moment, I just stared at the piles of papers on the desk, thinking about how Samuel had worked himself to exhaustion with double shifts to give Eric every opportunity, how he had coached him through baseball games and showed him how to change his first tire. And now here was that same boy, grown into a man so cold I barely recognized him. My voice trembled as I told him there had been something hidden inside the watch, that his father had left me a message. Silence stretched across the line, and I could almost hear him leaning forward. "What kind of message?" he asked at last. I hesitated because this was the first time since the funeral that Eric had sounded remotely interested in anything connected to his father, and his sudden alertness rang in my ears like an alarm. I told him vaguely that it looked like account numbers, maybe a password, but probably nothing important. There was a sharp inhale on his end. Then his voice shifted, quicker, sharper, almost greedy. "Mom, what exactly did it say?" And I knew with a heaviness that settled deep in my bones that whatever Samuel had hidden wasn't just a mystery, it was a threat to the son. I thought I knew. Eric's voice sharpened on the other end of the line. "Maybe I should come over, help you figure it out." That actually made me laugh, a bitter, jagged sound I didn't recognize as my own. Yesterday, he told me I needed to stop clinging to the past, and today he was suddenly eager to sort through Samuel's belongings, like a dutiful son. I shot back that helping wasn't the same as stealing, and he let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Fine, be stubborn, but don't come crying to me when you drive yourself crazy chasing ghosts." Then the line went dead, leaving me staring at my reflection in the darkened phone screen, the weight of suspicion settling hard in my chest. His sudden interest didn't make sense. Eric had spent months treating Samuel's possessions like clutter, meaningless relics of a life he didn't value. If they were truly worthless, why was he so desperate to know what Samuel had left behind? Unless, of course, they weren't just sentiment. Unless he already suspected there was more. The thought made me grip the arm of Samuel's chair tighter, my pulse quickening. I pushed the phone aside and turned back to the desk, but this time I forced myself to think differently, not like a grieving widow searching for scraps, but like Samuel himself, an accountant by trade, a man who lived and breathed systems, patterns, and logical progressions. I spread the code out in front of me and whispered it again. S4457C H0815DS. Piece by piece, I started to pull it apart. S. Could it stand for Social Security? My mind jumped to Samuel's number, but his began with 457, not 4457. Maybe Chicago, the city where we'd built our life together, raised Eric, and spent every year of our marriage. The next part, 0815, stopped me cold. August 15th, our wedding anniversary. My breath caught in my throat, and then DS. For a moment, I thought of Samuel's initials, K, but that didn't fit. Then it hit me. DS wasn't him at all. DS was me, Frances Dorothy Keller. My initials, my name woven into the code like a hidden thread, proof that whatever Samuel had concealed, he meant for me, and only me, to find it. I set Samuel's note on the desk and pulled my laptop closer. My hands shaking so badly, I had to steady them against the wood. I'd worked with numbers my whole life, but never with a code like this. I knew that Swiss banks and offshore firms use strings like the one I'd found, and something in my gut told me this wasn't just a coincidence. I searched for hours, the glow of the screen washing over piles of Samuel's old files, until at last a name popped up, Atlantic Trust Investment Group. Cayman Islands. The website was spare, almost clinical, polished in the way that tells you it was designed for people who didn't need to ask questions. Privacy, security discretion. It made my skin prickle. When the login page loaded, my throat tightened. There it was, 2 blank fields, client number, password. I typed the code slowly, each character a drumbeat in my chest. SS4457. CH0815DS. The page blinked, then shifted. Valid account number. I covered my mouth with my hand, my heart hammering so loud it seemed to echo through the room. Now came the password. Something Samuel would have trusted me to know. Something meant only for me. I tried the obvious. Our wedding date. The address of our first apartment. Even my birthday. Each rejection hit like a slap. Cold and final. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my temples, when my eyes landed again on Samuel's handwriting. He hadn't written my actual birthday. He'd written the date he said he knew he'd marry me, July 15th, 1955. Not the day I was born, but the night of that summer dance in Boston Common, where Samuel had stood across the room in his pressed shirt, smiled at me with that shy determination, and told his buddy he'd marry me someday. I could still hear the music of that night in my ears as I typed 071555. For a breathless moment, the screen held me hostage, then shifted. Access granted. My whole body went cold. The numbers filled the page like a punch to the chest. $2,147,029.67. Nearly $3 million hidden away for decades, right under my nose. I sat frozen, staring until the digits blurred and burned themselves into my vision. Samuel had concealed a fortune from me through all the years of stretching paychecks, clipping coupons and telling me there wasn't enough. I didn't know if I wanted to scream, cry, or laugh at the sheer madness of it. $2.8 million. I just sat there, staring at the number on the screen. My breath caught in my throat, an account I had never heard of, in a bank I hadn't even known existed, tucked away on some island far from Boston, hidden by the same man who had spent 43 years telling me we were scraping by, who had sighed at me for buying brand-name cereal, who had worn the same frayed work shirts I mended over and over while I clipped coupons at the kitchen table. Every petty argument about money, every anxious night wondering if we'd have enough for retirement, all of it came rushing back in one dizzy wave. And all the while, Samuel had been quietly tucking away a fortune where I couldn't see it. The first feeling that hit me was rage, hot and blinding. It wasn't just the money, it was the deception, the silence, the way he had let me carry the weight of worry for decades, while he held a secret safety net. 43 years of a mission felt like betrayal, pressing down on my chest. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling, before I finally clicked on the account history, desperate for answers. The records opened like a timeline of another life. The first deposit glowed on the screen, 1982. 3 years after Eric was born, $5,000. The note beside it read, Initial Inheritance Investment, SK. I blinked hard, reading it twice. Inheritance? Samuel had never once mentioned receiving any inheritance. We had scraped and struggled through those years, or at least I believed we had. I scrolled through line after line, each entry tightening the knot in my stomach. Small deposits at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, steady, deliberate, like drops of water filling a bucket. All those years when I thought we had nothing extra, when I stretched groceries with casseroles and secondhand sales, he had been building something in the shadows. I pressed my palm flat against the desk to steady myself, because the truth was dawning on me. Samuel hadn't just been frugal, he had been hiding an entire parallel financial life. As I scrolled deeper through the records, the picture sharpened into something I couldn't ignore. Those steady, modest deposits, 500 here, 1,000 there, suddenly made sense of Samuel's relentless penny pinching at home. He hadn't been hiding money from our paychecks. He had been quietly building something separate, brick by brick, right under my nose. But then, around 2008, the pattern shifted. The numbers jumped from hundreds to tens of thousands. Entries marked with $10,000 and $20,000 at a time. My stomach turned when I saw the notations beside them. Real estate liquidation. Boston properties. My hands went cold. Samuel had been buying and selling properties I'd never even heard about, let alone seen. Entire investments, business dealings, entire worlds he had kept cordoned off from me. How could you share a bed with someone for 43 years, raise a child, build a life, and not know they were conducting secret business transactions? I felt like I was living with a ghost, a man who had smiled at me over morning coffee while juggling an entirely separate existence after he kissed me goodbye. Then something caught my eye on the screen, a folder tucked among the account records, labeled simply for Francis, emergency access only. My heart leapt into my throat as I clicked it open. Inside was a single video file, dated just 3 months before Samuel died. I froze, the cursor hovering, my finger trembling on the trackpad. I wasn't sure if I was ready to see his face, to hear his voice delivering whatever truth he had carried in silence all those years. But it was past midnight, and I was alone in our bedroom, surrounded by decades of paper and grief. My son had stolen the only physical clue, and now this glowing screen was all I had left. Ready or not, I needed answers. When I finally clicked play, Samuel's face filled the monitor. He looked older, more worn than I remembered. His shirt slightly wrinkled, the office light casting shadows under his tired eyes. He spoke slowly, his voice steady but threaded with sadness. "Francis, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and something has gone wrong. I hoped you'd never need to find this account, that we'd grow old together, and I'd tell you over dinner someday. Not like this." He rubbed his face the way he always did when he was trying to work through a hard problem, and I felt my throat tighten. "The money isn't mine, sweetheart. It was my father's. He hid it away before he died in 1981. He made me promise to protect it, to only use it if our family was ever in real danger." I could see the weight in his eyes as he said it, and suddenly I remembered those years. Eric was just a toddler when Samuel's father died, and Samuel had been devastated. Back then I thought the small inheritance that paid off our mortgage was everything. Clearly it wasn't. Samuel leaned closer to the camera, his voice soft but insistent. "My father lived through the Depression. He knew how quickly stability could vanish, how one bad turn could break a family. He wanted to make sure his grandchildren would always be protected, no matter what happened. I've invested carefully, every penny documented, everything legal. It's grown over the decades, but it was always meant as insurance, money to be touched only if catastrophe ever came." The video went on with Samuel explaining details I could barely process. Account numbers, legal protections, cautious strategies he had mapped out like the careful accountant he'd always been. But all I could hear was one phrase repeating in my head, pounding louder than the rest. "I hoped you'd never need to access this account." My stomach knotted. Samuel hadn't been sick. He'd collapsed at work with no warning, a heart attack that blindsided all of us. So how could he have known? Why would he think I might one day need this money, as if he had been bracing for something he didn't get the chance to tell me? unless the catastrophe he was guarding against wasn't random at all, unless he had seen it coming from inside our own family. The next morning, I called the library and told them I was sick. For 6 months, I had gone in to shelve books and hush noisy teenagers just to keep myself upright, but now that felt meaningless. I had more pressing work. Work Samuel had left unfinished. I needed to understand what he meant by real danger. The account record stretched back 40 years, but I went straight to the recent deposits, my pulse quickening. The last one was dated just 2 weeks before Samuel died. $25,000. The note beside it chilled me. Property sale. Emergency liquidation. Emergency. That word felt like a warning he had whispered from beyond the grave. My hand shook as I scrolled through earlier entries, realizing Samuel had been selling off assets rapidly, turning investments into cash in the final months of his life. I opened my laptop and dug into public property records, cross-referencing deeds and transfers. The man I thought I knew, the husband who wore patched shirts and told me we couldn't afford takeout, had been a quiet real estate mogul, moving properties all over Boston. My chest constricted as the truth crystallized. Every single one of those sales in the past year, every last deed, had gone to the same buyer, Keller Capital Partners. Keller, my family name, my son's name. The room tilted. Eric. Could he have been behind this? I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and dialed my nephew Danny, the one who'd built his career in real estate. If anyone could pull the curtain back, it would be him. When he answered, his voice warm as always, I forced my own to stay steady. Danny, it's Aunt Frances. I need to ask you something about a company, Keller Capital Partners. If anyone knew the ins and outs of Boston property deals, it was my nephew, Ryan Whitfield. He'd been in real estate long enough to have his ear to the ground, and when he answered, his voice carried that easy warmth I'd always leaned on. Aunt Frances, how are you holding up? I swallowed the lump in my throat and said I was fine, though we both knew I wasn't. Then I cut straight to it. Honey, have you ever heard of a company called Keller Capital Partners? The line went quiet for a beat before he answered. Actually, yeah. They've been very active lately, snapping up properties in good neighborhoods, all cash, quick turnaround. Why do you ask? My pulse quickened. Do you know who owns it? I pressed. Ryan hesitated, then said, I can find out. Give me an hour. That hour stretched like a lifetime. I couldn't sit still, so I went back to Samuel's desk and dug deeper, rifling through drawers and folders I had walked past for years. The smell of dust and old paper clung to my hands as I opened the filing cabinet, pushing past 40 years of meticulously labeled tax returns. Tucked at the very back was a folder marked insurance policies. Relief flickered for a second. Maybe this was the kind of emergency planning Samuel had meant. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside weren't insurance forms at all, but contracts, property deeds, and letters tied to real estate investments I had never heard about. At the very bottom, buried under the weight of signatures and seals, was a single letter that made my hands tremble. I unfolded it carefully, my breath catching as I read the heading. A private investigator's report, dated 6 months before Samuel died. My eyes blurred as I forced myself to read. Mr. Keller, per your request, I have completed the investigation into your son, Eric Keller's financial activities. My whole body went cold. Samuel hadn't just been investing behind my back. He had been investigating our son. Samuel had known. He had known his own son was planning to rob us, and he hadn't lived long enough to warn me. All he'd been able to do was leave that hidden compartment in his watch, a clue for me to stumble across in the ruins of grief. Eric hadn't pawned Samuel's Rolex for vacation money like he claimed. No, he had taken it, because he suspected exactly what I now held in my hands, access to a fortune my husband had kept hidden. And now that he realized I'd found something inside the watch, I knew in my bones he wouldn't stop until he uncovered it, no matter what it cost me. I was still in Samuel's chair, the investigator's report spread across my lap, when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold, Laurie's key turning in my front door. She'd insisted on keeping a spare after the funeral, pretending it was so she could check on me when Eric was busy at work. Now I understood. She hadn't been checking on me. She'd been circling like a vulture, checking on Samuel's assets. "Francis, are you here?" Her voice floated through the hallway, coated in that artificial sweetness she reserved for strangers and manipulation. I shoved the report back into the folder, my fingers fumbling, and clicked my laptop screen down to the desktop with a speed I didn't know I had anymore. I wasn't ready to show my hand, not when I didn't even fully understand the game they were playing. From the bedroom I called out, forcing my voice to sound casual, steady, as though nothing was wrong. A moment later, they appeared in the doorway, Eric with a small suitcase dangling from his hand, and Lori dressed in vacation chic, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair, her outfit screaming luxury. "Just wanted to say goodbye," Eric said, but his eyes betrayed him. They weren't looking at me. They were darting across Samuel's desk, scanning the piles of papers I hadn't had time to put away, his gaze cataloging what he might have missed. And in that moment, I understood fully. This wasn't about grief, or family, or even memory. This was about a hunt. And my son, the boy Samuel had once carried on his shoulders through Boston Common, was hunting me. Eric's eyes flicked to the desk, and his voice came smooth, too smooth. "What are you working on?" I steadied myself and answered carefully, "Sorting through your father's things." "There's so much I never knew about." Lori stepped closer, her gaze locking onto my laptop screen. Her tone was sweet, but I could hear the sharp edge beneath it when she asked, "Find anything interesting?" That was when it hit me. These weren't casual drop-ins. They were reconnaissance missions. I forced a little shrug. "Just old bank statements and tax records. Your father kept everything. You know how thorough he was." Eric chuckled lightly, almost in relief. "Yeah, Dad was obsessive. Probably kept every receipt since the 80s. I watched his shoulders drop ever so slightly, and that's when I decided to test them. Actually, I did find something odd. Some kind of investment account I'd never heard about. Nothing major, just a few thousand." Their faces shifted instantly. Eric stepped forward, pretending to sound casual but failing, his voice too quick. "An investment account? What kind?" I shook my head. "I'm not sure. The paperwork is confusing. I might need to hire an accountant to sort through it." Lori's eyes cut to him, and I caught the look they exchanged. Fast, sharp, calculated. "We could help you with that," she offered smoothly. "Eric's good with financial documents." I almost laughed. "That's very kind, but I've already made an appointment with Samuel's old accounting firm. They know how to handle his investments properly." Eric's jaw tightened, his voice taking on a hard edge. "Mom, those guys charge $300 an hour. I can look for free." I locked eyes with him and said, "I can afford $300 an hour." Silence dropped like a stone. Lori's polished mask slipped, her concern curdling into something sharper, and Eric practically vibrated with frustration. Finally, Lori forced a smile. "We should get going. Don't want to miss our flight." But Eric stayed rooted, his stare burning into me. "Mom, about the message you found in Dad's watch. Maybe I should look at those numbers before we leave just to make sure they're not important." My stomach clenched. Lori's head snapped toward him. "What numbers?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. Eric shot her a warning look, but it was too late. "Mom found some kind of code in the watch. Probably nothing, but you never know." And just like that, Lori's vacation excitement dissolved into pure focus. "What kind of code?" she asked. Her words clipped. I rose from Samuel's chair, squaring my shoulders so I towered over her, my voice steady. "The kind that's none of your business." Lori's cheeks flushed, her polished facade cracking. "Excuse me?" I didn't blink. "You heard me. My husband left me a private message," private being the operative word. Eric stepped forward, his voice dipping into that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Mom, we're family. There's no need for secrets." I almost laughed at the irony. Secrets? Like the ones he thought I didn't know about. The gambling debts, the shell company, the properties purchased with money he didn't have. I let the words spill out, steady and sharp. Secrets like Keller Capital Partners? Or the $180,000 you owe to offshore gambling sites? The color drained from Eric's face, and Lori's mouth actually fell open before she snapped it shut again. I don't know what you're talking about, Eric stammered, but his voice cracked. Keller Capital Partners ring a bell? I asked, watching as both their faces went pale. Your father knew, Eric. He knew everything. Lori was the first to recover, her voice turning vicious, the sweetness gone. You crazy old woman. You don't know anything. I stepped closer, my voice quiet but unflinching. I know enough. I know about the debts, about your plans to have me declared incompetent, and I know you've been scheming for months. Eric slumped against the doorframe, the fight gone out of him, his eyes wide and lost. How? He whispered. I reached for the folder on Samuel's desk, the investigator's report heavy in my hands. Because your father hired a private investigator. Every lie, every debt, every betrayal, it's all here. I held the letter where Eric could see the letterhead, and the recognition in his eyes told me everything. That code you're so interested in? It's the key to more money than you could ever imagine, and it will never, ever belong to you. Lori grabbed his arm, hissing in his ear. We need to leave, now. But Eric just stared at me, something almost like respect flickering in his eyes for the first time in years. He really knew? He whispered. I didn't soften. He knew his son was planning to rob his own mother. What kind of man does that make you, Eric? For just a heartbeat, I saw the little boy I had raised, ashamed, confused, vulnerable. But then Lori's grip tightened, pulling him back to her, and the moment vanished. This isn't over, she spat as they stormed out. Yes, it is, I called after them, my voice ringing through the hallway. It's been over since the day you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. The front door slammed so hard the glass in the frames rattled, and I was left standing alone with Samuel's secrets and the heavy certainty that the real fight had only just begun. 2 mornings later, at exactly 8 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it could cut glass. A slim leather briefcase hung from her hand, and behind her stood a younger man with the stiff posture of someone fresh out of law school. Mrs. Keller, she called crisply. I'm Sharon Blake, from Blake & Associates. This is my associate, Kevin Ruiz. When I opened the door, they stood there looking polished and prepared. The woman in a dark tailored suit, hair pulled back into a sleek knot, and beside her a younger man balancing a leather folio and a tablet. Mrs. Keller, I'm Sharon Blake from Blake & Associates, and this is my colleague, Kevin Ruiz. We represent your son, Eric, in some family legal matters. That was one way to dress it up. I stepped aside enough to let them look at me properly, but I didn't invite them in. What can I do for you? I asked, keeping my voice cool. Sharon gave me the kind of smile you could tell had been practiced in the mirror 1,000 times, the kind meant to soothe while it slowly boxed you in. Your son is concerned about your well-being, she said smoothly. He's asked us to discuss some options that might be beneficial for everyone involved. I folded my arms, waiting. Kevin stepped forward, eager, holding up his tablet. We understand you may have recently come across certain financial accounts your late husband maintained. While we're sure he had good intentions, managing complex investments can be overwhelming, especially while you're grieving. Overwhelming. I almost laughed out loud, as if I hadn't spent 40 years balancing every household expense, down to the penny, stretching Samuel's salary, making do, while he quietly built a real estate empire I knew nothing about. I met Kevin's gaze and said evenly, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Sharon's smile didn't falter, not even a fraction. Of course you are, she purred. But consider this, your son could help shoulder that burden. We've drafted some documents that would grant Eric temporary power of attorney over your financial decisions, just until you've had time to properly grieve. There it was, plain as day, exactly what Samuel's private investigator had warned me about. A paper coup, dressed up as compassion. I repeated the words slowly, tasting it on my tongue. Temporarily? Sharon nodded smoothly. Yes, just until you're ready. My eyes narrowed. And who decides when my grieving period is over? For the first time, their composure slipped. Kevin glanced at Sharon, who kept smiling, but just a touch too tightly now. That would, of course, be at your discretion, he said quickly. Naturally. After Sharon and Kevin left, the house felt heavier than ever. I closed the door quietly, but inside my chest, everything was rattling. They hadn't even tried to hide the threat, sign my life away voluntarily, or be dragged into court and declared incompetent. For a moment, my knees went weak, and I had to steady myself against Samuel's desk. But then I remembered the words he'd left me. Protection. Samuel hadn't been careless. He had known this storm was coming. That afternoon, I picked up the phone and called the one number Samuel had scribbled into his notes, a name that had surfaced in the private investigator's report. Anthony Briggs. He answered with a voice like gravel, low and steady, the kind of voice that belongs to a man who has spent years sifting through other people's secrets. When I told him who I was, there was no hesitation. I've been expecting your call. We met later that day at a small diner near the harbor, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of fried food clinging to the air. Anthony slid into the booth across from me, his trench coat folded neatly, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He set a thick envelope on the table. Samuel hired me months before he passed. He suspected Eric was in over his head with debts and would eventually come after you. He wanted me to document everything and to make sure you weren't left alone to fight. My fingers shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a trove of protection, notarized affidavits, bank records, copies of Eric's fraudulent loan applications, photographs of meetings with men I didn't recognize, even transcripts of emails about offshore gambling. Anthony tapped the stack. If Eric or his lawyers try to push this in court, you won't be the one on trial. He will. Samuel made sure of that for the first time in months. I felt my lungs expand, a breath of air that didn't taste like fear. My husband had known the danger, and even from the grave, he had laid out the path for me to follow. The second Sharon and Kevin were off my porch, I shut the door in their faces and went straight to the number Samuel had left tucked away in his files. My hands trembled as I dialed, but the voice that answered was calm, steady, professional. Anthony Briggs. I swallowed hard. Mr. Briggs, this is Frances Keller, Samuel Keller's widow. There was the briefest pause. Then he said, Mrs. Keller, I've been expecting your call. Samuel told me you might need my services one day. My throat tightened. He did? Anthony's voice didn't waver. About 6 months before he passed, your husband asked me to prepare a comprehensive defense package in case anyone challenged your competency or your right to his assets. Everything is ready to go. My breath caught. Samuel had been 3 steps ahead, even in death. How ready? I asked quietly. His reply was blunt. By the time I present evidence of your son's gambling debts, fraudulent loan applications, and his attempts to manipulate you, he'll be lucky if he doesn't face criminal charges. For the first time in months, a genuine smile tugged at my lips. Mr. Briggs, I think it's time to make some phone calls. The next morning, I sat in Anthony's office, a sleek downtown space with tall windows overlooking Boston's skyline, the kind of place that smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. As he spread documents across his polished mahogany desk, the reality sank in. Samuel had been planning this confrontation long before his heart gave out. Anthony tapped one folder after another. Matter of fact, your husband was thorough. We have bank records of Eric's gambling losses, copies of fraudulent loan applications, transcripts of his attempts to push you into incompetency proceedings, even photographs of him meeting with estate lawyers. My hands froze on one stack of papers. Photographs are one thing, but audio recordings? Anthony nodded grimly. Yes, Samuel suspected Eric was planning something, so he had your house wired last year, completely legal since it was his property. He wanted proof. I leaned back in the chair, my pulse pounding as I thought about all the conversations Eric and Lori had had in my kitchen over the past 6 months. Every dismissive comment about my memory, every calculation about Samuel's assets, every cruel little joke about shipping me off to a nursing home. Samuel had heard it all. Even after death, he was still protecting me. And for the first time, I didn't feel like prey anymore. I felt like the hunter. Anthony leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on mine. "There's more," he said quietly. "Samuel also discovered that Lori has been systematically isolating you from family and friends. She's been telling people you're becoming senile, that you need supervision." The words hit like a slap, but in an instant, everything made sense. Why my sister-in-law had stopped calling after decades of Sunday check-ins. Why neighbors like Mrs. Grant had started looking at me with forced politeness, as though I might forget their names mid-conversation. Why the women in my book club had begun treating me like glass, smiling too brightly, changing the subject when I joined in. Lori had been laying the groundwork all along, whispering poison into every ear, making sure the idea of my incompetence sounded believable by the time Eric brought it to court. My voice cracked as I asked, "How extensive is the evidence?" Anthony's answer was blunt, extensive enough to dismantle any competency challenge and likely land both of them in prison for elder abuse and attempted fraud. He pulled a thick folder across the desk, the weight of it audible as it thudded against the wood. He tapped the cover once, firmly. Samuel made sure of it. Then Anthony reached for a smaller envelope, sealed, my name written across the front in Samuel's neat, deliberate handwriting. My chest tightened as though someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart. Anthony slid it toward me. "And there's something else. Samuel left specific instructions in case you ever needed to access the offshore account." My hand shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter dated just 1 week before Samuel's death. The sight of his handwriting, so familiar and so recent, made my eyes sting with tears. Even from the grave, Samuel was still speaking to me, guiding me, leaving behind one final trail of breadcrumbs. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, as though it carried the weight of Samuel's voice. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter, his neat handwriting pulling me back into 100 memories. Birthday cards, notes slipped into my purse, lists written with the same careful penmanship. At the top, in the words only he would choose, it began, "My dearest Frances, if you're reading this, then Eric has shown his true colors, and you've discovered the account I've been building for 40 years. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive, but I needed to protect it from him until the time was right. The money isn't just an inheritance, it's justice." I pressed a hand to my mouth as I read on. Samuel explained that every dollar came from investments he'd made using information Eric had foolishly bragged about over the years. When he started his real estate company, he couldn't help but boast about his inside deals, his guaranteed flips. He thought I wasn't listening. What he didn't know was that I was investing in the same opportunities with money he didn't know existed. Every property he turned, I bought 3 more nearby. Every stock tip he bragged about, I doubled down with funds from the inheritance my father left us. Eric unknowingly fueled his own downfall. His greed built your independence. Tears blurred the ink, but I kept reading. The offshore account exists because I used Eric's arrogance against him. And now it's your turn, Frances. Use his greed against him. Anthony has instructions to begin the transfers immediately. By the time you read this, you'll have financial independence Eric can never touch. But more important than money, you'll have power. The power to decide how this ends. You can forgive him, care for him despite his betrayal, and pray he finds redemption, or you can let him face the consequences of trying to steal from his own mother. The choice is yours, my love. I sat there at Samuel's desk, the letter trembling in my hands, my heart torn between fury and grief. Even from the grave, Samuel had laid the truth bare. Eric had built his own trap, and Samuel had handed me the key to spring it. The question was no longer if I could fight back. It was how. At the bottom of the letter, Samuel had written the words that broke me. It always has been, forever yours, Samuel. My hands trembled as I set the paper down. He hadn't just protected me from Eric. He had built Eric's own downfall brick by brick, using the same greed and arrogance that had nearly destroyed us. Across the desk, Anthony Briggs was watching me closely. His voice low. "Mrs. Keller, are you ready to proceed?" I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting second, I saw Eric as a little boy on his first day of school, clutching Samuel's hand with wide-eyed excitement. But the image was quickly replaced by the memory of him standing in my kitchen just 2 days ago, calling me a crazy old woman while Laurie sneered at me like I was already buried. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. I looked Anthony in the eye and said firmly, "File every piece of evidence we have with the authorities, and do it today." The next morning, chaos shattered the quiet calm of my Boston street. I was at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and pretending to read the newspaper, when 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of Eric and Laurie's house. Men in FBI windbreakers poured out, their voices clipped and professional as they carried box after box out of the front door. Filing cabinets, hard drives, stacks of documents. My son's empire, dismantled piece by piece, right before my eyes. My phone rang, and when I saw his name, I already knew what I would hear. "Mom!" Eric's voice was panicked, cracking. "What did you do?" I kept my tone even, my gaze fixed on the sight outside my window. "I protected myself. Something you should have done for your family instead of trying to rob us." His voice dropped into a plea. "You don't understand. This will destroy us." I felt a surprising calm wash over me as I answered, "No, Eric, you destroyed yourselves. All I did was document it." The phone rang again, and this time it was Laurie's voice, shrill and venomous. "You vindictive old witch. We were trying to help you." I gripped the receiver tighter, the calm in my voice belying the fury in my chest. "By stealing Samuel's watch? By plotting to have me declared incompetent? By whispering lies about my mental health until my own neighbors looked at me like a fragile burden?" For a moment, there was only silence on the line except for Laurie's uneven breathing. I didn't let it hang there long. "Samuel knew everything, Eric. Every debt, every lie, every plan you made to rob us. He spent the last year of his life protecting me from his own son." Eric's voice cracked through the speaker. "Raw. Dad wouldn't." I cut him off. "Your father hired a private investigator. He documented your gambling addiction and your fraudulent loans. And yes, he wired our house for sound, so every time you and Laurie joked about locking me away in a nursing home, he heard it. I've heard it now, too." On the other end, I heard Eric make a sound I'll never forget, something between a groan and a whimper, the sound of a man cornered by his own reflection. I pressed on. "The FBI is hauling away your business records because Samuel left evidence of the fraud you built your company on. The IRS is auditing you because you hid income, and the state attorney's office is investigating you for elder abuse." For the first time in months, his bravado collapsed. "Mom, please." His voice broke like a child's. "I never meant for it to go this far." My eyes stung, but I forced myself to ask the question that had haunted me. "When did it start, Eric? When did you decide your mother was worth more to you dead than alive?" The silence was long and heavy, and when he finally spoke again, his words came out as a whisper. "When I realized Dad had been hiding money from us. Last Christmas, I saw some paperwork in his office, references to accounts I'd never heard of. And just like that, the last thread that tied us together snapped. When Eric finally said the words out loud, I felt my whole body go cold. I thought if you both died, everything would come to me automatically." The honesty was brutal, jagged like broken glass, but in a strange way it cut through the months of lies, manipulation, and false concern. It was the clearest truth he'd given me in years. I swallowed hard and said quietly, "You were wrong. Samuel made sure everything would be protected from you." There was a pause, then his voice cracked again. "How much? How much did he hide?" I looked at the letter still resting on Samuel's desk, my fingers tracing his careful handwriting, and I answered, "Enough to ensure I never have to. Depend on family who sees me as a burden." And then I hung up. Through the window, I saw the end of it all unfolding in real time. 2 FBI agents escorted Eric out of his front door, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and hollow. Lori came next, thrashing and shouting, her designer scarf twisted as she screamed at the agents, no doubt demanding her lawyer, threatening lawsuits, still playing the part of the woman too entitled to believe consequences could touch her. But Eric, my son, just looked broken, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. For a moment I saw him as a boy again, standing in the schoolyard clutching his backpack, terrified of being left behind. The image stung, but it didn't undo what he had become. The shrill ring of the phone startled me back to the present. I almost didn't answer, but when I saw the name on the screen, I sighed and picked it up. Dorothy? It was Helen Patterson from next door, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. I just wanted to apologize. Lori told me you were having memory problems, and I believed her. I should have spoken to you directly. Her words carried shame, and for the first time I realized just how far Lori's whisper campaign had reached. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile into my voice. It's all right, Helen. She can be very convincing. There was a pause, then Helen's voice dropped, heavy with curiosity and sorrow. Is it true what they're saying, that Eric was planning to steal from you? I looked across the room at Samuel's photograph on the mantel, his smile frozen in time, his eyes steady even in black and white. The scent of his old leather chair lingered in the air, as though he had just gotten up to fetch his coffee. My throat closed, but I managed to say, it's true, but it's over now. After I hung up, I sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence. The weight of betrayal pressed against me. But so did something else. Relief. Relief that Samuel had seen what I couldn't, that he had protected me even from the grave. Relief that for the first time in months, I wasn't alone in the dark. I was bruised, yes, but I wasn't broken. And as I wrapped my hands around the warm mug of coffee, I realized that while the fight had ended, the healing was only just beginning. When Richardson Hale opened the blue velvet box and set it gently on Anthony's desk, my eyes locked on Samuel's Rolex as if it were a living thing, breathing with the weight of memory. I had seen it 1,000 times on my husband's wrist, felt its steady presence against his skin when we danced, heard the faint click as he wound it every morning while coffee brewed in the kitchen. And now, after all the chaos, it sat gleaming between us like a silent witness to everything we had endured. Richardson's voice was calm, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to revealing truths carefully, as though each word might shift the ground beneath my feet. And when he leaned forward, his eyes softened in a way that told me he understood what this moment meant to me. He explained that Samuel had entrusted him with more than just the task of retrieving the watch, should it ever leave my possession. He had been asked to safeguard its secrets as well, because the Rolex was more than a timepiece. It was a vessel, a safeguard, something designed with intention far beyond sentiment. Richardson slid the watch closer and pointed to the crown, describing how a jeweler Samuel trusted had altered its internal mechanism to hold more than just a hidden compartment, and beneath layers of steel and gears was a secondary chamber, one Samuel had never told anyone about, not even me. Inside it, Richardson said, was a microfilm strip containing records of Samuel's earliest investments, evidence of Eric's financial misdeeds that went back decades, and even copies of signed statements that would corroborate everything Anthony and I already had in the legal files. My breath caught because I realized Samuel had planned for every possibility, had prepared not only for betrayal, but also for the disbelief that might follow, ensuring that no one could dismiss my claims as grief-driven paranoia or the bitterness of a widow left behind. The watch wasn't simply a symbol of love or memory anymore. It was a fortress, a carefully constructed defense that made certain Eric's lies could never overwrite Samuel's truth. And as Richardson described how he had been instructed to reveal this secret only if the family itself turned against me, I felt my hands tighten in my lap as a wave of sorrow and gratitude washed over me in equal measure. Even in death, Samuel had been 3 steps ahead, weaving protection into the smallest details of our lives. Anthony leaned forward, already strategizing, his pen scratching across the page as he muttered about how this new evidence could strengthen every case. But I barely heard him because my eyes remained on the Rolex, seeing not the shine of gold and steel, but the weight of 43 years of marriage, the countless mornings, the sacrifices I had misunderstood, the silences I had misinterpreted, the hum of the office, the faint smell of leather and ink, the cool air from the vent above. It all blurred around me as I reached out and finally touched the watch, my fingers brushing the familiar ridges. The metal was cool, but beneath it I swore I felt the warmth of Samuel's hand, as if he were still guiding me, still protecting me, still reminding me that while betrayal had nearly destroyed me, love had armed me with something stronger. Richardson picked up the Rolex again, turning it carefully in his hands, and with a deliberate movement pressed against the backplate until a faint click sounded. My breath caught as a second hidden compartment slid open, even smaller than the first, revealing not folded paper this time, but a tiny black micro SD card. He placed it on the desk with reverence, his voice steady but weighted. Samuel recorded everything, Mrs. Keller, every conversation Eric had about manipulating you, every private meeting with lawyers about declaring you incompetent, every whispered discussion about what to do with your assets after you were gone. My head swam, the room tilting slightly, because I could not yet fathom that Samuel, the man who had always seemed so calm and methodical, had been secretly gathering evidence against his own son. Anthony took the card and slid it into his computer, and within seconds the screen was alive with folder after folder, each labeled with dates and details, audio files, video recordings, financial documents, even photographs. Hundreds of pieces of evidence cataloged with Samuel's precision. I stared at the screen, frozen, as Anthony clicked one open, and Eric's voice filled the office, unmistakable, cold, joking with Lori about how easy it would be to push Mom into assisted living. My stomach twisted, my nails digging into my palms as the reality hit. Samuel had heard all of it, had sat alone in his office listening to his own child speak of him with contempt, and yet instead of despairing, he had quietly built an unbreakable defense so that I would never be left vulnerable. The weight of Samuel's last years pressed against me like a tidal wave. I remembered how tense he had seemed, how often he had claimed to be stuck at late meetings, how sometimes he would come home looking worn and distant. I had believed he was hiding from me, pulling away in his grief or exhaustion, and I had resented the silence. Now I understood he hadn't been hiding at all. He had been working every night to protect me, sacrificing his own peace to build a wall of proof no court could ever tear down. Even after his death, he was shielding me, whispering across time that I was not alone and never had been. Richardson's eyes softened as he leaned closer, lowering his voice as though what he said next was meant for me alone. "There's one more thing, Francis." My heart thudded painfully, my throat tightening as I braced myself for another revelation. The Rolex lay between us like a living relic, its secrets unfolding piece by piece, and I realized there might still be more Samuel had hidden, more he had prepared, more he had left behind, not only to guard me but perhaps to guide me toward the future he had imagined when he began all this so many years ago. Richardson reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick sealed envelope, its surface marked in Samuel's unmistakable hand. Final instructions. Francis's protection plan. My chest tightened as I broke the seal, the paper crackling under my fingers. Inside was a document that stole my breath the moment I began to read. Samuel had written, "In the event that Eric Keller attempts legal action against Francis Keller's mental competency, the following assets will be transferred immediately to Boston Children's Hospital in Eric Keller's name. all property owned by Keller Capital Partners, all gambling debts and outstanding loans, all legal fees and court costs tied to elder abuse charges. My hand shook as I understood. Samuel had arranged it so that Eric would inherit nothing but his own destruction. Every debt, every liability, every ounce of shame, all of it neatly redirected by the man he thought he could outsmart. Anthony let out a low whistle, admiration clear in his voice. Your husband was brilliant, Francis. He turned Eric's greed into a legal snare. Richardson nodded, his expression grave. Samuel knew Eric would never stop chasing the money, so he built a trap that would spring the moment Eric made his move. He ensured that any attempt to strip you of your rights would result not in your loss, but in Eric losing everything he already had. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of it pressing down on me, realizing that my quiet, meticulous husband had spent the final years of his life orchestrating a strategy so airtight it could stand as precedent in any courtroom. I reached for the Rolex, the metal cool and familiar in my palm, and let its weight ground me in the flood of revelations. For 43 years, I had believed I was married to a simple man, an accountant who pinched pennies and lost sleep over retirement projections. Instead, Samuel had been a master tactician, layering protections like a chess grandmaster, anticipating every possible betrayal, ensuring that his family's future couldn't be stolen by the son we had raised together. My throat tightened with grief, but there was pride, too. Pride that even as his heart had failed him, his mind had never stopped working to shield me. Richardson slid another envelope across the desk, this one unsealed, the flap slightly bent as though it had been opened and closed many times. His voice softened, carrying a weight of finality. Mrs. Keller, your husband asked me to give you a final message if this day ever came. My fingers hesitated on the paper, trembling as I reached for it, because I knew whatever words lay inside would be the last Samuel ever spoke to me, the true end of our conversations, the final piece of love and strategy he had left behind. The doorbell kept ringing softly, and I stood frozen for a moment, the towel still in my hands, my heart pounding with the unease of old wounds and the fragile hope of something new. Through the peephole, I saw her again, a young woman with Eric's eyes, but softer, more searching, her nervous smile betraying a mixture of fear and longing. When I opened the door, the cool evening air rushed in, carrying the smell of cut grass and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Grandma Frances, it's Hannah. Hannah Keller. Hearing my last name spoken with that note of hesitancy nearly brought me to my knees, because in her I saw both the boy I had raised and the mistakes he had made written into her features. I invited her inside, the aroma of garlic and rosemary filling the small kitchen, and she sat gingerly at the table, her hands clasped as though in prayer. She explained that she hadn't known the full extent of her parents' choices until the news broke and the trial began, that she had been sheltered from much of it, but could no longer avoid the truth. There was shame in her eyes, but also courage, the kind of bravery it takes for a young woman to step into the house of the grandmother her parents had tried to undermine. I listened in silence, every word pulling at the tight weave of bitterness I had carried for months, loosening it thread by thread. As she spoke, I noticed details that felt achingly familiar, the way she tilted her head the same way Samuel once did when he was trying to read a person, the faint dimple that matched Eric's childhood smile before life hardened him, the stubborn spark that reminded me of myself when I was her age. She said she wanted to know me, to understand the family beyond the shadows of fraud and betrayal, to build something her parents had never managed. My chest ached, torn between caution and the overwhelming instinct to reach across the table, to take her hands in mine, and promise that the sins of her parents did not have to define her future. For the first time in a long while, I realized that the story wasn't closing with courts, or prisons, or even Samuel's brilliant strategies. It was shifting toward something more fragile and precious, the possibility of redemption through the next generation. As the evening darkened outside and the warm light of my kitchen wrapped around us, I looked at Hannah and felt something stir inside me, a quiet certainty that maybe Samuel's greatest gift wasn't just the protection of money or documents, but the space for me to choose forgiveness when the time was right. And sitting there with my granddaughter, I knew the choice was beginning now. I hadn't seen Hannah since Samuel's funeral, when she was just finishing college and nervously starting her first job, a moment that now felt like a lifetime ago. Lori had made sure to cut me off from the grandchildren along with everyone else, weaving lies that spread faster than I could correct them. So when I opened the door that night and saw Hannah standing there, twisting her hands together as if unsure whether she had the right to be on my porch, my heart caught. "Grandma Frances, I know I should have called first," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I heard about Dad and Lori, about what they did to you, and I wanted to apologize." I shook my head, my voice soft but firm. "You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart." She bit her lip. "I do, though." I knew something was wrong. Dad kept asking strange questions about Grandpa Samuel's finances, and Lori always made comments about your memory. I should have said something. I studied her face, the familiar line of her jaw, the honest glint in her eyes that reminded me of Samuel more than anyone else, and I felt warmth spread through me despite the ache of betrayal that still lingered. "Come in, Hannah. Let's talk over dinner." As the smell of roasted vegetables filled the kitchen and candles flickered against the window, she told me about her new job teaching elementary school, the long hours, and the joy of seeing children light up when they understood something new. She told me about her engagement to a young doctor who adored her, and finally, haltingly, about her guilt over her father's crimes. "I keep thinking I should visit him in prison," she admitted, "but I'm so angry about what he did to you." I reached for her hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers. "Anger is normal," I said quietly. "But Eric is still your father." Her eyes searched mine. "How can you not hate him?" For a long moment I couldn't answer. My mind drifted back to Samuel's final letter, the one where he had offered me a choice between forgiveness and justice, a choice I had carried like a stone in my pocket ever since. Finally, I said, "Because hate would mean he still has power over me. I choose peace instead." Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I missed you so much. Ashley told everyone you were confused, that you didn't want to see us anymore." I squeezed her hand, my voice breaking but steady. "I never stopped wanting to see you, and I never will." Later, as we cleared the dishes together, she paused in front of the photo of Samuel on the mantel. "I always wondered why Grandpa wore that watch every single day." "He must have really loved it," I smiled, feeling the familiar weight of it against my wrist. "He loved what it protected," I said softly. That night, after Hannah left with promises to visit every week, I carried a blanket out to the porch and sat watching the sunset spill colors over the quiet waters of the lake. The Rolex ticked against my wrist, keeping perfect time, its weight steady and reassuring. Samuel had been gone 8 months, and yet in every revelation, in every carefully laid protection, I felt his presence, as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. The greatest love stories, I realized, aren't about flowers or grand gestures, but about protection, the kind of love that builds shields you don't even know you'll need until the battle comes. Samuel had spent the last 2 years of his life preparing for a war I never saw coming, ensuring that his death wouldn't leave me defenseless against the greed of our own son. Some people spend their whole lives searching for a love that enduring. I'd been lucky enough to wear it on my wrist, day after day, for 43 years. And if you've been listening to my story all the way through, I'd really love to hear what you think. Drop a comment and tell me how you felt about it. Let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever lived through something that made you stronger than you thought you could be. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because every story we share here reminds us that even in the darkest moments, we're never really alone.